There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a small town when violence visits it. And on the 28th of October, 2006, that silence fell over Port Antonio, a quiet coastal corner of Portland Parish, Jamaica. On the grounds of a church, a place built for peace, for prayer, for refuge, a 52-year-old man lay gone. He had not passed away in a hospital bed. He had not faded quietly into old age. He had been struck down, violently, in the very town where his life had begun more than half a century earlier. That man was Trevor Berbick, and the cruelest part of his story is this. He had once held one of the most prestigious prizes in all of sport. He had stood across the ring from Muhammad Ali and won. He had traded blows with Larry Holmes for 15 punishing rounds. He had faced a young, terrifying Mike Tyson when the whole world was watching. He had survived all of them. He had survived the hardest men the heavyweight division could throw at him. And yet, in the end, he did not fall to a younger, hungrier fighter. He did not fall in some distant arena under bright lights. He fell at home, and according to reports, he fell to his own blood. How does a man travel from the very summit of professional boxing to a violent, lonely end on a church lawn, caught in a bitter dispute over land with a member of his own family? That is the mystery at the heart of this story. And to understand it, we have to go all the way back to a naval base in a foreign country, to an Olympic stage he had no business standing on, to the night he ended the career of the most famous athlete alive, and to the slow, painful unraveling that followed. Before he became a man whose own nephew would one day stand trial for his murder, Trevor Berbick was a teenager with almost nothing. A young man who first laced up a pair of boxing gloves, not to chase glory, but simply to protect himself. Trevor Berbick was born on the 1st of August, 1954, in the Norwich area of Port Antonio in Portland Parish, Jamaica. This was a working-class stretch of the island, far removed from the world of championship belts and pay-per-view spectacles. It was a place of ordinary struggle, where a young man's future was rarely measured in titles or fortunes, but in whatever work he could find and whatever strength he could carry. And Berbick's path to boxing began in one of the most unlikely places imaginable. As a young man, he made his way to the Guantanamo Bay United States Naval Base in Cuba. It was there, on foreign soil, surrounded by a world that had nothing to do with the bright marquees of professional prize fighting, that he first picked up the sport. He did not take up boxing because he dreamed of becoming a champion. He took it up, by his own account, as a means of self-defense, a way to handle himself, to survive, to stand his ground. Think about the strangeness of that beginning. The future heavyweight champion of the world did not start in a gleaming gym with a wise old trainer guiding his every move. He started on a military base, throwing punches out of necessity, learning to fight because life demanded it of him. There was another thread woven into those early years, one that would resurface decades later in a way few could have predicted. Berbick described a spiritual experience at the age of 16, a moment of faith that he carried with him. It is a detail easy to overlook in a boxer story, but hold on to it. Because the same man who would one day be deported, who would face grave trouble with the justice system, would also one day stand behind a pulpit in Las Vegas, preaching to a congregation. The fighter and the believer lived side by side in him from the very start. From that naval base in Cuba to the Olympic stage took only a handful of fights, and remarkably, Trevor Berbick would soon represent Jamaica at the 1976 Montreal Games, with barely a dozen amateur bouts behind him. To understand just how raw Trevor Berbick was, You have to understand the company he was already keeping. In 1975, at the Pan American Games in Mexico City, Berbick took the bronze medal in the heavyweight division. He lost in the semifinals to a man named Michael Dokes, a fighter who would go on to become a heavyweight champion in his own right. So even at this early stage, with hardly any experience, Berbick was brushing shoulders with the elite of the division. The raw material was undeniable. Then came the biggest amateur stage in the world. In 1976, Trevor Berbick represented Jamaica at the Montreal Olympics. And here is the detail that stops you cold. He arrived with only 11 amateur bouts to his name. 11. For most fighters, 11 amateur fights is barely the beginning of an education. Most Olympic boxers had fought dozens, sometimes hundreds of times before reaching that level. Berbick walked into the games with almost no foundation at all. In Montreal, he lost to Romania's Mircea Sheeman, a skilled fighter who went on to win the silver medal. On paper, it was a defeat. But look closer at what it really represented. A man with practically no amateur grounding had stood on the world's grandest amateur stage and held his own against a future silver medalist. That tells you everything about Berbick's gifts. The natural strength, the physical power, the toughness that came to him almost by instinct. But it also hints at the cracks that would follow him for the rest of his career. A fighter built on raw tools, rather than years of refined schooling, can rise fast and far. He can shock the world. But the gaps in his foundation never fully disappear. They wait, and against the very best, they tend to show. After Montreal, Berbick made a decision that would shape the entire rest of his life. He did not return home to Jamaica. Instead, he stayed in Canada and quietly began building a professional career out of an unlikely city far to the north, Halifax, Nova Scotia. It was an unusual choice for a heavyweight chasing the world rankings. After the Olympics, Berbick settled in Montreal and built the foundation of his professional career out of Halifax, Nova Scotia, hardly the traditional breeding ground for a future champion of the world. There were no famous fight factories there, no legendary gyms producing one contender after another. But Berbick was never a man who followed the expected path. And at first, the results were spectacular. He won his first 11 professional fights, 10 of them by knockout. That is the kind of start that makes promoters lean forward in their seats. 10 knockouts in 11 outings announced one thing loud and clear. This man could punch. The raw power that had carried him through the amateurs was translating into the professional ranks, and it was carrying him with frightening efficiency. But boxing has a way of humbling even the most promising. On the 3rd of April, 1979, Berbick suffered his first professional defeat, and the sting of it ran deep. He lost to Bernardo Mercado, a man he had comfortably beaten back in their amateur days. Imagine that. A fighter you had already conquered who turns the tables on you once the stakes and the class are raised. It was an early, painful lesson in just how thin the margins are near the top, and how a step up in competition can ruthlessly expose a fighter built primarily on natural tools. Still, the setback did not stall him. That same year, on the 26th of May 1979, Berbick captured the vacant Canadian heavyweight title, a tangible reward for his rise, and proof that the loss to Mercado had not broken his momentum. He was now a title holder, a recognized force, a name climbing steadily up the ladder. Then, in 1980, came the win that changed everything. A knockout of a former world champion put Trevor Berbick on a direct collision course with one of the most feared men in all of boxing, and the first of 3 legends who would forever define his name. That man was Larry Holmes. By 1980, Trevor Berbick was no longer just a promising puncher from an unlikely corner of the boxing world. He was knocking on the door of the elite, and the moment that kicked that door open came when he stopped former champion John Tate in the 9th round. It was the kind of victory that demands attention, a decisive finish against a man who had once worn a world title. With that win, Berbick earned the prize every contender dreams of, a shot at the championship of the world. Standing in his way was Larry Holmes, the reigning World Boxing Council heavyweight champion and one of the most formidable fighters of his era. Holmes was at his peak, a master of the jab, a relentless and intelligent boxer who had already turned away challenger after challenger. For a fighter with Berbick's thin amateur background and his still developing skills, this was the deep end of the ocean. On the 11th of April, 1981, the two men met. And while Berbick did not win, what happened told you a great deal about the man. He went the full 15 rounds. He lost by unanimous decision, yes, but he was not stopped, not broken, not overwhelmed. Against a peak Larry Holmes, 15 full rounds was a testament to Berbick's durability, his heart, and the kind of toughness that no amount of polished technique can teach. He could take the very best a great champion had to offer and still be standing at the final bell. But this night planted something else, too. Something darker, something personal. The seeds of a bitter animosity between Berbick and Holmes took root here. It was a tension that would simmer quietly for years before finally boiling over, a decade later, into a public physical confrontation that would be caught on video and replayed for a stunned boxing world. The respect of the ring would curdle into something uglier. For now, though, Berbick had proven he belonged. He had lost to Holmes, but he had survived him. And his next fight would hand him a place in history that no one, no matter what came after, would ever be able to take away. Because Trevor Berbick was about to share a ring with the most famous athlete who ever lived. By the end of 1981, the name Muhammad Ali still carried a kind of magic that no other athlete on earth could match. He had been the most famous man alive, a champion, a poet, a symbol of pride and defiance, a figure whose face was known in every corner of the world. But by then, Ali was 39 years old. The legs that had once danced were heavy now. The reflexes that had once seemed supernatural had dulled. The body that had absorbed years of punishment was no longer the body of the man who had electrified the planet. And on the 11th of December, 1981, in Nassau, in the Bahamas, it was Trevor Berbick who stood across the ring from that fading legend. Berbick won. He beat Muhammad Ali by unanimous decision. There was no controversy about it, no robbery, no whispered doubt. The judges saw what everyone watching saw, a younger, stronger man taking the measure of an aging icon who had stayed in the sport just a little too long. When the final bell rang that night, it marked the end of one of the greatest careers in the history of athletics. Muhammad Ali would never fight professionally again. And so Trevor Berbick became something permanent. He became the last man to ever share a professional ring with Muhammad Ali. It is a distinction that would follow him everywhere for the rest of his life, printed in every article, repeated in every introduction, attached to his name like a shadow that never left. But think about the bittersweet weight of it. Berbick had not beaten the Ali who lit up the world. He had beaten a shadow of that man, a fighter the years had hollowed out. There was no glory in conquering greatness in its twilight. If anything, there was something mournful about it, a young contender standing over the fallen giant of his sport, knowing that the world would remember him not for the victory itself, but for the funeral it marked. There was another distinction quietly forming around Berbick, too. According to boxing records, he is believed to be the only professional fighter ever to have shared the ring with all three of the era's defining heavyweights, Muhammad Ali, Larry Holmes, and the man who was still only a teenager, a name most of the world had not yet learned to fear, Mike Tyson. Three legends, one man who fought them all. You would think that beating Ali, even an aging Ali, would have made Trevor Berbick a star overnight, a household name, a magnet for the biggest fights and the brightest lights. But fame in boxing is a fickle thing. It would take nearly 5 more years, a move to a new country, and a partnership with one of the most controversial figures the sport has ever known before Berbick would finally wrap a world championship belt around his own waist. The road back to relevance ran through hard work and hard fights. In 1982, Berbick faced an undefeated prospect named Greg Page, a fighter many believed was destined for greatness, and beat him. It was the kind of win that kept Berbick in the conversation, that reminded the boxing world he was still a dangerous man, still a name to be reckoned with among the heavyweights. Then, in 1984, came a decision that pulled Berbick fully into the high-stakes machinery of 1980s boxing. He moved to Miramar, Florida, and he signed with the most powerful and most controversial promoter in the entire sport, Don King. With that signature, Berbick entered a world of money, politics, and maneuvering, a world where careers could be built or buried, depending on who was in your corner outside the ropes. King's stable was the center of the heavyweight universe, and now Berbick was part of it. The climb resumed. On the 15th of June, 1985, Berbick stopped David Bay by technical knockout to capture the United States Boxing Association heavyweight title. It was not a world championship, but it was a crucial stepping stone, a way to rebuild his ranking, to reestablish himself as a legitimate contender, to position himself for one more run at the prize that had eluded him against Larry Holmes years earlier. And then came the night that defined the very peak of his career. On the 22nd of March, 1986, Trevor Berbick challenged Pinklon Thomas for the World Boxing Council Heavyweight Championship of the world. Thomas was the heavy favorite. The betting odds had him at 6.5 to 1. The boxing establishment expected Berbick to lose. He was supposed to be the stepping stone this time, the name on the other side of someone else's victory. But over 12 grueling rounds, Berbick wore Thomas down. He used his strength, his quickness, his durability, all the raw tools that had carried him since those 11 amateur fights, and he turned them against a man the whole world had picked to beat him. When the final scores were read, Berbick had won by unanimous decision. The long shot from the naval base in Cuba, the man with almost no amateur foundation, the fighter who had gone the distance with Holmes and ended Ali's career, Trevor Berbick was now the heavyweight champion of the world. It was the summit, the dream realized, the proof that all the toughness and instinct had been enough in the end to reach the very top. But here is the cruel irony. On the night Berbick claimed his crown, the boxing world was barely paying attention to him. Its eyes were already fixed on something, someone else. A terrifying 20-year-old wrecking machine out of Brooklyn was tearing through the division, leaving a trail of demolished opponents behind him. And Berbick's very first title defense would be the night that young man rewrote the record books. On the 22nd of November, 1986, at the Las Vegas Hilton, Trevor Berbick walked to the ring to defend the World Boxing Council Heavyweight Championship for the first time. Across from him stood Mike Tyson, 20 years old, undefeated, and chasing a piece of history. Tyson was hunting Floyd Patterson's record. If he won, he would become the youngest heavyweight champion in the history of the sport. What happened next lasted barely more than a single round of action, and yet it has been replayed for decades as one of the most unforgettable scenes the heavyweight division has ever produced. In the second round, Tyson found his range and unleashed the kind of power that would soon terrify an entire generation of fighters. He dropped Berbick to the canvas. Berbick climbed back to his feet. The same toughness that had carried him 15 rounds with Larry Holmes, refusing to let him stay down. But Tyson came again, and late in that second round, he dropped Berbick once more. And then came the image that no one who saw it has ever forgotten. Berbick tried to rise. His will was there. His pride was there. But his legs were gone. He pushed himself up, staggered, pitched sideways, and crashed back down to the canvas. He tried again, and again his body betrayed him, sending him stumbling across the ring like a man on the deck of a ship in a storm, unable to find the floor beneath him. Referee Mills Lane took one look at a champion who could no longer command his own body and waved the fight off. It was over. A technical knockout in the second round. Do the math of that fall. Trevor Berbick had become champion on the 22nd of March, 1986. He lost the title on the 22nd of November of the same year. His reign as heavyweight champion of the world lasted under 9 months. A single defense, ending in those 2 devastating rounds. And the same night that crowned a young Mike Tyson as the youngest heavyweight champion in history was the same night that effectively pushed Trevor Berbick out of boxing's center stage. The spotlight that had finally found him swung away, and it would never fully return. Tyson became the future of the sport. Berbick became a name in the story of someone else's coronation. He would fight on for years to come, but he would never hold a world title again. And as the bright lights of championship boxing moved on without him, a different kind of trouble began moving into his life, the kind that doesn't happen inside the ring, the kind that follows a man home. Some grudges in boxing are settled in the ring and forgotten. Others fester. The bitterness between Trevor Berbick and Larry Holmes was the second kind. A slow-burning animosity that had taken root back on that April night in 1981 and refused to die. For a decade, it simmered beneath the surface, surfacing in interviews and barbs, the kind of personal grievance that grows uglier the longer it goes unresolved. Then, in 1991, it finally boiled over. And unlike most private feuds, this one was caught on video for the whole world to see. According to reports at the time, the confrontation stemmed from remarks Berbick had made about Holmes's family. For Holmes, that crossed a line that years of in-ring rivalry never had. What followed was a chaotic, very public physical altercation. Holmes was recorded launching himself at Berbick, reportedly leaping down from atop a parked car to get at him. It was not the controlled violence of a sanctioned bout. It was raw, unscripted, and shocking. 2 former world champions tangled in a street-level brawl until police stepped in to separate them. The footage became one of those strange, sad artifacts of the sport. 2 men who had once competed for the heavyweight championship of the world, reduced to grappling in public over wounded pride and cruel words. There was no referee here, no judges, no belt on the line. Just anger that had been allowed to fester for 10 years, finally exploding into the open. But the incident revealed something important about the man Trevor Berbick was becoming outside the ropes. His conflicts were increasingly spilling beyond the ring. His words got him into trouble. His temper found its way into public spaces it never should have reached. The same combustible intensity that had made him a dangerous fighter was beginning to look like something harder to control in ordinary life. And the truth is, the brawl with Holmes was far from the most serious trouble brewing in Berbick's world. While the cameras caught the spectacle of two old rivals fighting in the open, a far darker chapter was quietly unfolding in his private life, one that would land him in confinement, strip him of the right to live in the countries he had called home, and begin a long, painful exile that would eventually carry him all the way back to where he started. By the early 1990s, the shape of Trevor Berbick's career had begun to blur. He was no longer the rising contender, no longer the reigning champion. He was a former title holder, chasing relevance in a division that had moved on without him. And that search for relevance led him to some strange and far-flung places. In December of 1991, Berbick traveled all the way to Japan for one of the most unusual bouts of his entire career. It was a cross-discipline contest, pitting the boxer against a professional wrestler named Nobuhiko Takada, under a special set of rules that blended the two combat worlds. It was the kind of spectacle that fighters past their prime sometimes find themselves drawn into, exotic, lucrative, and far from the traditions of championship boxing. But the night went badly, and it went strangely. By Berbick's own account, he had been misled about the rules of the contest, particularly the matter of kicks, which he claimed he had not understood would be allowed. Faced with a style of combat he insisted he had not agreed to, Berbick simply exited the ring. Takada was awarded the victory by default. Now, it must be said that Berbick's version of events was his own. A trainer connected to the Japanese promotion disputed it on the record, insisting that no rules had ever been changed and that nothing had been hidden from him. So we are left with two competing accounts of that bizarre night: a fighter who claimed he had been double-crossed, and an organization that said he simply walked away from something he had agreed to all along. The truth, as is so often the case in Berbick's story, sits somewhere in the contested space between the two. Whatever really happened in Japan, the episode captured something undeniable about where Berbick's career had landed. He was now a fighter taking strange paydays in distant lands, far from the marquee nights that had once defined him. He would resume traditional boxing in 1994, frequently appearing on the American broadcasts of Tuesday night fights, trying to recapture some piece of what he had been. But the results told the story of a man whose best days were behind him. He lost to younger contenders, to rising prospects like Jimmy Thunder and a hard-hitting young man named Hasim Rahman, fighters who were climbing the ladder Berbick had long since descended. The man who had beaten Muhammad Ali and won the world championship was now, increasingly, a name used to test the next generation. And as his career drifted toward its end, the troubles waiting in his private life were about to step fully into the light, beginning with a grave legal matter that would change everything. For all the punishment Trevor Berbick had absorbed inside the ropes, the blow that did the most lasting damage to his life landed nowhere near a boxing ring. It came in 1992, in the state of Florida, in a courtroom rather than an arena. That year, Berbick was convicted of a serious criminal assault involving a young woman connected to his own household. Out of respect for the person harmed, the details are best left where the court left them. What matters to the arc of this story is the consequence. He was sentenced to 5 years in confinement and served roughly 15 months before being released. But those 15 months were only the beginning. A conviction like that does not simply end when the confinement does. For a man who was not a citizen of the country he lived in, it set in motion a long, humiliating chain of consequences that would follow him across borders for the rest of his life. In 1997, Berbick violated the conditions of his parole. He was deported from the United States, removed from the country where he had built his championship career, where he had signed with Don King, where he had raised part of his family, and sent north into Canada. Canada offered no permanent refuge either. In 1999, Canadian authorities moved to revoke his landed immigrant status, ordering him returned to Jamaica because of his ongoing legal difficulties. Then, in a rare turn in his favor, he won the right to remain later that same year. The deportation order was reversed. It was a reprieve, not a rescue. On the 2nd of December 2002, Berbick was deported from the United States a second time. 2 separate expulsions from one nation, a near expulsion from another. A former heavyweight champion of the world, now a man whom governments kept trying to send away. Through all of it, he clung to one thing he had carried since he was 16 years old: his faith. There is a thread that runs through Trevor Berbick's entire life, easy to lose sight of beneath the noise of courtrooms and championship belts. It is the spiritual experience he described having at 16, long before the Olympics, long before Ali, long before any of the trouble. In the years after boxing, that thread finally surfaced in the most public way it ever would. For a period after his fighting days, Berbick stood not in a boxing ring, but behind a pulpit. He served as a preacher at the Moments of Miracles Pentecostal Church in Las Vegas. The man who had traded blows with the hardest heavyweights of his era, who had been deported and confined, now stood before a congregation speaking of faith and redemption. The believer who had lived inside him since boyhood was finally given room to speak. There was quieter work, too. In the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, Berbick trained young boxers in New Westminster, British Columbia, and worked at Kenny Barrett's gym in Tamarack, Florida, trying to pass on the hard-earned trade of his life to fighters only beginning theirs. And then there was family. 3 children from his first marriage in Montreal and 4 more with his wife in Florida, where he hoped to settle down and retire. 7 children. A man trying, in the only ways he knew, to build something ordinary and lasting out of a life that had been anything but. But the picture was never as peaceful as he wanted it to be. Even as he preached and trained the next generation, his legal troubles refused to release their grip. And there was one more reckoning still waiting, one that had nothing to do with the law, and everything to do with the punishment his body had taken across a lifetime in the ring. Some fighters know when to walk away. Trevor Berbick was not one of them. After returning to traditional boxing in 1994, he became a familiar face on American broadcasts, but familiar in a way that carried its own quiet sadness. He was the recognizable name, the former champion brought in to test the ambitions of younger, hungrier men. Too often, those younger men passed the test at his expense. Still, he would not stop. The stubborn will that had carried him 15 rounds with Larry Holmes and pulled him off the canvas against Mike Tyson kept dragging him back to the ring well past the point where most men would have surrendered to age. His final professional fight came on the 26th of May, 2000. Remarkably, he went out with his hand raised, a 12-round unanimous decision to retain the Canadian heavyweight title, the very title that had launched his career more than 2 decades earlier. A career that began in Canada, ending with a Canadian crown still around his waist. There was a strange symmetry to it. But the victory came with a verdict no fighter wants to hear. The medical examination that followed revealed a blood clot in his brain. His boxing license was revoked. The decision to retire was no longer his to make. And so, the ledger closed. 49 wins, 33 by knockout, 11 losses, 1 draw. 61 professional fights in all. From a naval base in Cuba to the Olympic stage with barely a dozen amateur bouts, to the night he ended Muhammad Ali's career, to the heavyweight championship of the world, and finally to a quiet Canadian arena where it all came to rest. With boxing behind him and his health compromised, Berbick returned to where everything had begun, to Port Antonio, Jamaica. He did not know he was walking straight toward the most tragic chapter of all. He had survived Ali. He had survived Holmes for 15 rounds. He had been pulled off the canvas against the most feared puncher of a generation. He had survived confinement, deportation, and the slow erosion of his own body. And after all of that, Trevor Berbick came home to Jamaica, to the same coastal parish where he had been born more than 50 years before, believing perhaps that the worst was finally behind him. It was not. The danger waiting for him in Port Antonio did not wear the face of a stranger. It wore the face of family. Berbick had become entangled in a bitter dispute over land, the kind of quarrel that in close communities can fester for years and poison the bonds of blood. And at the center of that dispute was not some distant enemy. It was his own nephew, a young man of 20 named Harold Berbick. On the 28th of October, 2006, that conflict reached its terrible end. Trevor Berbick was attacked on the grounds of a church in Port Antonio, a place of worship, the same kind of sanctuary where, in another chapter of his life, he had stood as a preacher. He suffered repeated blows to the head and passed away there at the scene. He was 52 years old. The man who had absorbed the punches of 3 heavyweight legends had been struck down at last, not by a champion under bright lights, but on a quiet church lawn in the town of his birth, by someone who shared his name. 2 men were arrested in connection with the killing: Harold Berbick and an 18-year-old companion later identified as Kenton Gordon. On the 3rd of November, 2006, both were formally charged with murder. It is a betrayal almost too cruel to hold. A man comes home seeking peace at the end of a hard life and meets his passing at the hands of his own kin over a piece of earth. The fighter who had conquered the giants of his sport could not escape the smallest and most intimate of human conflicts. Justice arrived in a Jamaican courtroom more than a year after that October morning. On the 20th of December, 2007, Harold Berbick was convicted of the murder of his uncle. Kenton Gordon was convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter. On the 11th of January, 2008, Harold Berbick was sentenced to life in prison, and Gordon received a term of 14 years. But how do we measure a life like Trevor Berbick's? It is tempting to reduce him to his most painful moments: the confinement, the deportations, the grave legal matter, the violent end. To stop there would be a disservice to the full, complicated truth of the man. Remember where he began: a young man on a naval base in a foreign country, picking up boxing not for glory, but simply to protect himself. A long shot who walked onto the Olympic stage with barely 11 amateur fights to his name. A fighter who built his career out of an unlikely northern city and rose against every expectation all the way to the championship of his sport. And remember what he accomplished. He is the last man to ever share a professional ring with Muhammad Ali, a distinction no fighter who comes after him can ever claim. He is believed to be the only man to have faced all 3 of his era's defining heavyweights: Ali, Holmes, and Tyson. He defeated Pinklon Thomas as a heavy underdog to win a world title the experts swore he would never hold. Those are not the achievements of a footnote. They are the achievements of a genuinely formidable fighter who earned his place in the history of the heavyweight division. The tragedy of Trevor Berbick is the distance between those two truths, the heights he reached and the depths he fell to. The same toughness that made him nearly impossible to keep down in the ring could not protect him from the troubles that found him outside it. The same faith he carried from boyhood could not shield him from a quarrel that ended his life on a church lawn. Trevor Berbick was born in Port Antonio, and in Port Antonio he passed away. Between those 2 points lay a life as dramatic, as triumphant, and as heartbreaking as any the sport has ever known. He was the last man to fight Muhammad Ali, and now, finally, his story has been told in full.